The first time Nora saw the ring, she was on her knees. She had been sent to the dowager's dressing room to collect the morning tray before the household rose properly, to slip in and out without disturbing the Duchess's rest. The room held its darkness well, the heavy curtains still drawn against the November morning, and Nora moved across the carpet with the practiced silence of 3 years in service, her hands already reaching for the porcelain cup and its saucer. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth was not asleep. She sat before her looking-glass, still in her dressing robe, one hand extended toward the maid who arranged her hair each morning. The candlelight caught the jewels laid out on the velvet tray beside the powder pot. Nora did not look at them, as a rule. She had learned early in her time at Ashworth House that looking too long at beautiful things in rooms where one had no right to be beautiful was its own kind of transgression. She gathered the tray. She turned to go. The candlelight shifted. The Duchess lifted her hand to examine a ring the maid had just placed upon the smallest finger, and the garnet caught the light, and the gilt setting flared amber, and Nora went very still in the doorway. She knew that ring. She knew the particular thinness of the band, the way the stone sat slightly left of center in its mount, because her mother had caught the setting on a door handle once, years before Nora was born, and the jeweler who repaired it had never quite restored the original symmetry. She knew the 2 small chips at the base of the stone, almost invisible unless you had held the ring in your own hands and turned it toward a window on a bright afternoon, which Nora had done perhaps 100 times as a child, watching her mother smooth it onto her finger the way other women smooth a glove. The Dowager Duchess met her own eyes in the glass, then Nora's. And then Nora walked out of the room and down the servants' stairs and stood in the cold stone passage below until her breathing steadied. The morning went on around her. The kitchen filled with noise. She carried wood and water and cleared grates and said nothing to anyone, because what she had seen seemed to her, in those first hours, like something that could not possibly be true. And speaking an impossible thing aloud was the surest way to make oneself a fool. The ring had belonged to her mother. She held that sentence inside her for the rest of the day, turning it the way her mother had once turned the ring, examining it from all angles in the light. Harriet Fielding had been companion to the old Duchess of Ashworth for 11 years. Through the late Duchess's long illness and the 3 years of quiet widowhood that followed. She had been a gentlewoman by birth, reduced by circumstance as so many were, and she had served with the particular dignity of someone who understood that the work beneath her station did not diminish her unless she permitted it to. Nora had been born during those years of service to a father she had never known, and she had spent her first 5 years at the edge of the great house, in the rooms where companions kept themselves. The old Duchess had been kind. That was what Harriet always said. Not effusive, not demonstrative, but kind, in the way that mattered, which was to say she had seen Harriet as a person rather than as a convenience, and she had marked that seeing in the way available to her. On the morning of the old Duchess's death, Harriet had found the ring on the beside table with a folded note beneath it. The note said only that the ring had been purchased in Florence in 1787, and that the Duchess wished Harriet to have it as a remembrance of faithful service. Harriet had wept, and put the ring on, and worn it every day of the 11 years that remained to her. When Harriet died, the ring had been on her hand. It was no longer there when the undertaker came. Nora had been 19 years old, and she had not possessed the words. Then, to say what she suspected, she had not possessed the standing. She had possessed nothing at all, in fact, except the position at Ashworth House that a different, colder member of the household had offered her out of what Nora had understood even then was not charity, but calculation, because a daughter kept silent in ways a stranger could not be relied upon to manage. The amber bead at her throat had been her mother's as well. It was all they had allowed her to keep. She touched it now, standing in the passage, and thought about the ring on the dowager's hand. If you have ever found yourself watching the people in a great house move through their days with the perfect confidence of those who have never been required to account for themselves, you will understand something of what Nora carried through that November. A word here about the story that follows. Before we go further into it, this household held a secret for 15 years. What happens next is what it costs to speak the truth aloud. When every arrangement of power in the room insists you have no voice. If that is the kind of courage you need to witness today, stay close. The weeks of her mother's employment that Nora remembered most clearly were not the grand ones, not the dinners or the assemblies or the occasions when the house filled with visitors and candles were lit in every room. What she remembered were the quiet mornings, when Harriet had sat at the window of their small shared room and taught Nora her letters, using the margin of a discarded letter as a slate and a stick of charcoal as a pencil, her voice low and even and patient, as though literacy were simply something one did before breakfast. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth had been in residence at Ashworth House for 31 years. She had outlasted the old Duke by 15 of them. She was a handsome woman, precise in her movements, and she organized her world, with the particular efficiency of someone who had never needed to question whether the world was hers. To organize. She had been a viscount's daughter before she married, and she wore that fact the way she wore her jewels, as evidence of what she was owed. She spoke of Harriet Fielding only twice in Nora's hearing, and both times it was the same word. "The companion," she said, as though companion were a category rather than a person, a piece of domestic furniture whose individual specifications did not merit attention. It was in the linen corridor, 3 days after Nora had seen the ring, that she overheard the Dowager speak to Miss Philippa Crane. Miss Crane was the daughter of Sir Edward Crane, and had been a guest at Ashworth House for a fortnight along with her mother, Lady Crane. She was fair-complexioned and composed, and wore the correct expression for every occasion, with the facility of someone who had been practicing expressions since childhood. The Dowager clearly found her satisfactory. They walked together through the upper passage in the late afternoon, while Nora worked at the linen press, invisible in the alcove behind the half-open door. "You need not concern yourself with the household arrangements," the Dowager said. "I manage them entirely. The servants know their place." "And this one," Miss Crane said. A pause. The particular pause of someone glancing toward something beneath their notice. "Just a maid," the Dowager said, and her footsteps continued down the corridor. Nora counted the sheets in the press and did not move until the passage was empty. It was 2 days after this that the household learned the Viscount was expected home. Edmund Carew, Viscount Ashworth, arrived in the 3rd week of November on a gray afternoon, riding rather than carriage, which was understood below stairs to mean he had ridden hard from London, and had not wished to wait for the slower conveyance. Nora watched from the upstairs gallery window as he dismounted in the courtyard. He was tall and wore black still, the morning coat not new, but well-maintained, and he handled the reins with a practiced economy that suggested a man who had spent time in the field. His face, when he turned it upward toward the house, was unreadable. He did not look like a man who was glad to be home. She did not encounter him that first day, nor the second. She encountered him on the 3rd, which was a wet Thursday morning, in the kitchen passage near the scullery door. She had not expected him to be in the kitchen passage. Lords did not frequent the kitchen passage. She had a bundle of kindling in her arms and nearly walked into him entirely, catching herself at the last moment, the kindling shifting dangerously, and he put out one hand and steadied the bundle from beneath before it could fall. His hand was close to hers. She felt the warmth of it through her sleeve. "Steady," he said, not unkind, measured. She stepped back. She thanked him, correctly, with her eyes down, and continued to the scullery. She heard him pause in the passage for a moment before he went on, and she did not look back to see his expression, but she felt a pause the way one feels a change in air pressure before weather arrives. The witnessing came 3 days after that. Betsy was the youngest of the housemaids, 14, and not yet skilled enough to be trusted with the finer rooms, and she had broken a small glass oil lamp in the upper hall that belonged to a set the Dowager valued. The breakage had been reported to Mrs. Hatch, the housekeeper, who had reported it to the Dowager, and the Dowager had requested that the matter be investigated before she determined who was to bear the cost. It was the kind of investigation that had only one possible outcome. Betsy had carried the lamp, Betsy had dropped it. Betsy would pay. Mrs. Sabat. Hatch assembled the upper servants in the housekeeper's room on a Friday morning and asked who had been present in the upper hall at the relevant hour. There were 4 of them. Nora was one. She knew what the question was really asking. Someone needed to confirm Betsy's account, or contradict it, or add nothing of use, and the girl could not afford to lose a week's wages. The lamp was already loose in its fitting, Nora said carefully. I noticed it the previous morning when I polished the table beneath it. The fault was in the fitting, not in Betsy's handling. Mrs. Hatch looked at her steadily. And you failed to report this. I intended to mention it, Nora said, and I am sorry that I did not do so before the accident occurred. It was not the complete truth, and it was not a lie. She had noticed the fitting. She had not thought it urgent. The rest of what she had said was true in the way that mattered, which was that the child had not been careless and did not deserve to be made poorer for it. She did not know Edmund Carew was in the doorway behind her, till she turned to go, and found him standing there. He had come to speak to Mrs. Hatch on a household matter. He had arrived in time to hear the exchange. His eyes were on Nora's face, and his expression was not the absence of feeling she had expected. He said nothing. He stepped aside to let her pass. She went on down the passage, and did not allow herself to think about the quality of that look for the remainder of the day. She was not entirely successful. The fortnight that followed was the careful kind, where nothing overtly happens, but everything shifts slightly, the way furniture in a room seems to be in different positions each morning, though no one has moved it in the night. The Dowager's plans for Miss Crane and the Viscount advanced along their determined course. There were dinners at which the arrangement of seating placed Miss Crane at Edmund's right hand, and Nora served the soup. There were parlor evenings at which Miss Crane played the pianoforte with considerable skill, and Edmund sat nearby with an expression of measured courtesy, and Nora carried the tea things in and out and did not look at the garnet ring on the Dowager's hand if she could help it. A footman named George told her one evening, with the casual cruelty of someone who did not realize it was cruel, that someone below stairs had heard she had asked old Mr. Den, Draper's clerk, about the estate gift records when he'd visited to consult with the Viscount on a legal matter the week before. She had asked, it was true, carefully, and with what she hoped was the ordinary curiosity of someone settling a small administrative question. She had not yet determined what she meant to do with the answer if she received one. The answer had not yet arrived. It was at the dinner table 2 weeks into the Cranes' visit that the Dowager delivered the second dismissal. A footman had brought a note to the dining room, a folded message from Mrs. Budden. Hatch and the Dowager had read it, and then looked at Edmund at the head of the table with an expression Nora, standing at the sideboard, could not quite interpret. One of the maids has apparently requested an audience with you, the Dowager said, with the particular inflection that makes a reasonable thing seem absurd. Fielding, I believe. Edmund looked up from his plate. When? This morning, apparently. Mrs. Hatch thought it warranted my attention before any reply was made. Then a reply will be made, he said, and returned to his dinner. The Dowager set the note aside. She is just a maid, Edmund. Whatever she imagines she needs to discuss with you is surely something Mrs. Hatch can resolve. He said, I expect you are right, and asked Lady Crane to pass the salt. Nora carried the plates to the kitchen and said nothing. She did not receive a reply to her request that day, nor the next, and she began to understand that the request had not been forwarded. It was in the library that she found him on a wet Tuesday evening in December. She had come to replace a spent candle in the bracket nearest the window, and had not expected the room to be occupied. It held its silence differently when someone was present, she thought, as she stopped in the doorway. He was standing at the shelves nearest the fireplace, not reading, simply standing with one hand on the spine of a volume and his eyes on something that was not in the room. The portrait of the old Duke hung above the mantel, the frame dark with age, the painted face composed and benevolent. Nora had stood before that portrait many times. She knew its every detail. The hand, she had observed, rested on a desk, and there was a ring on the smallest finger, a garnet in a gilt setting, the stone sitting slightly left of center in its mount. She had told herself she was imagining it. The portrait was old, and the light in the library was low. She had looked at it again 3 days ago, in the afternoon, when the room was empty, and the winter sun came through the east window. She had not been imagining it. "Come in," Edmund said without turning. He had heard her. Then, despite her care, she replaced the candle in the bracket. She was nearly gone before he said, "You sent a message to Mrs. Hatch." She turned. "I did, my lord." "What did you wish to discuss?" She looked at the portrait above the mantel and then at the man below it, and she thought of her mother's hands and the amber bead and the cold morning in the undertaker's room when she had been 19 years old. And wordless. "A household matter," she said. "It will keep." He studied her for a moment with those gray eyes that missed less than they appeared to. "Sit down," he said. The word, level, without excess. She did not sit. She was a maid, and the library was not the right room for sitting. He seemed to accept this. He turned back to the portrait, and she watched him look at it. "You knew my father," he said after a moment. It was not quite a question. "My mother did," she said. "She was companion here to the late Duchess. I was a child. I remember the house." He was quiet. His hand dropped from the shelf. He moved to the chair nearest the fire and sat, not in the manner of a man at ease, but in the manner of a man who has been on his feet for too many hours. She should have gone. She stayed. "Matthew," he said, very low, and she understood this was not addressed to her. Then, as though he had decided something. "My brother. He died at Salamanca. He had my commission. I had purchased it, and then he asked for it, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought he would be safer in the regiment, I knew." She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve the sentence, and she knew enough about grief to know that improvement was not what it required. "He was not safer," Edmund said. The fire settled. Outside the window, rain moved across the park. "The house feels like the wrong answer to a question," he said, and she knew he did not mean the architecture. "Yes," she said simply, and meant it in her own way, for her own reasons. He looked at her then, and something in his face shifted by a fraction, the particular shift of someone who is expected to speak alone, and found instead that they are speaking to a person. She curtsied and went out, and she touched the amber bead at her throat in the cold passage, and she thought about the portrait, and the ring, and the old Duke's gift ledger. And she thought that she needed the answer from Mr. Palina, Draper's records, before she could say anything that could not be unsaid. The answer came the following morning, in a way she had not anticipated. Mrs. Hatch found her in the linen room just after 6, and told her the dowager wished to see her in the morning, room at 9. Her voice was careful. Her eyes were not. Nora dressed with particular neatness and went to the morning room at 9, and found it occupied not only by the dowager but by Lady Crane, who stood near the window with her hands folded and her expression arranged in the specific shape of a woman who has been asked to witness something unpleasant, so that it cannot later be disputed. The dowager sat at her small writing desk. She did not invite Nora to sit. "I have received information," the dowager said, "that you have been making inquiries into estate matters that do not concern you." Nora kept her hands still at her sides. "My Lord's solicitor's office was kind enough to answer a question I had regarding the household records." "You had no business placing any question before Mr. Draper's office." "No, my lady." "Then you understand you have exceeded your station in a serious way." Nora looked at the ring on the dowager's smallest finger and did not look away. The dowager saw her looking. The silence in the room changed quality, as a room changes when a door somewhere in the house has been opened to the winter air. "I shall require you to be gone from this house by morning," the dowager said. "A reference will be provided reflecting your length of service. Mrs. Hatch will see to your wages." Lady Crane by the window said to no one in particular, "One does not expect this kind of trouble from just a maid. It is always the ones who think themselves above their station." Nora looked at Lady Crane and then at the dowager and said, "Yes, my lady," and curtsied and went out. She went upstairs to her small room under the eaves, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and she thought about what she had just agreed to. She had agreed to nothing. She had said yes, in the way that the powerless say yes, which is to say, she had said it to close the door of the room and buy herself the hours remaining until morning. She got out her traveling box from under the bed and opened it, and looked at the few things inside it, and then she did not pack them. Not yet. She thought of her mother at the window, with the charcoal and the letter's margin. She thought of the amber bead. She thought of the portrait above the library mantel, and the ring in the painting, and the ring on the dowager's hand, and the particular thinness of the band and the stone sitting slightly left of center in its mount, because her mother had caught the setting on a door handle once, years before Nora was born. She put on her cloak and went back down the stairs. She found Edmund in the study, where the household accounts were kept, the candles lit against a gray December afternoon. He was at the desk, but he was not reading the papers in front of him. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw in her face caused him to set the papers aside without remark. She stood in the center of the room, and she said it plainly, the way her mother had said everything that mattered, without embellishment, because the truth did not need embellishment, and also because she was not certain she had enough composure left for anything more elaborate. "The Duchess has dismissed me. Before I go, there is something I need to tell you. The garnet ring your mother wears on her smallest finger. The one that was painted onto your father's hand in the library portrait, in the gilt setting, with the stone left of center. That ring belonged to my mother." Edmund was very still. "The old Duchess left it to her. There is a note, in my mother's letters, describing it. I believe your father recorded it in the estate gift ledger. I believe Mr. Draper's office can confirm this, because I asked them. And I believe the answer is what brought me here." He said after a moment, "When did your mother die?" 11 years ago. She died in service." He looked at the window. The December light was failing. He looked back at her, and she saw in his face the thing she had not quite been able to name in the library, the recognition of a person who has been carrying something alone for longer than was just. "You will not pack your box tonight," he said. It was not a question. She recognized the manner of it now, the short declarative that was functionally something else entirely, and she felt the warmth of it at a distance the way one feels a fire through glass. "My lord," she said. He stood. He went to the door, and she heard him in the passage, calling for George to send immediately to Mr. Draper's residence. She went back upstairs and did not unpack the box because she had learned the difference between a man's intention and its execution. And she was not a fool. She sat on the bed and touched the amber bead and waited. The morning came gray and clear, frost on the inner edge of the window glass. She heard the carriage at 9:30, the household assembled in the drawing room not by coincidence. The dowager had arranged a small gathering for the Cranes before their departure that afternoon, an occasion for a kind of informal announcement that had been building for the fortnight of their visit, the thing the dowager had been maneuvering toward with the precision of someone who has played this particular game before and won it every time. Miss Crane sat on the settee in ice blue silk, composed and correct. Lady Crane stood near the window. 2 other families had been invited. The Astons from the neighboring estate, and the Reverend Mallory and his wife, who attended for reasons Nora did not entirely understand, but suspected had to do with proximity to a certificate. Nora was not supposed to be in the drawing room. She was supposed to be gone. She stood in the passage outside it instead, and heard the voices within, and heard the dowager's measured tones beginning the preamble that would end with Miss Crane's hand announced for the Viscounts, and she thought, "So this is how it ends," and touched the cord at her throat. The front door opened. Edmund came in from the cold, with Mr. Draper beside him, the elderly solicitor in his traveling coat with mud from the road still on it, a leather ledger under his arm. Edmund did not stop in the hall. He went directly to the drawing-room doors and opened them. The room looked at him. He walked to the center of it, and Mr. Pay. Draper followed, and the assembled company understood from the manner of their arrival that this was not an entrance that would be interrupted. The dowager rose. "Edmund, we are in the middle of something." "Id bib." "I know what we are in the middle of," he said. His voice was level. He was not unkind. He was also entirely immovable. "I need a moment." He looked past his mother toward the door, and Nora understood that he could see her in the passage, and that the look was an invitation. She entered the room. She felt the eyes of the assembled company settle on her. She felt Lady Crane's particular attention, the recalibration of a woman doing rapid social arithmetic. Miss Crane's composure did not alter, but her eyes moved from Edmund's face to Nora's, and then to the floor. The dowager's face was a careful thing. Mr. Draper opened the ledger to a page he had already marked. He held it toward the light and read from it in the unhurried voice of a man who has spent 40 years in legal proceedings and knows that speed is not the ally of precision. He read that on the 14th day of March, in the year of our Lord 1806, the Duchess Dowager of Ashworth, Charlotte Nee Harrington, had caused to be recorded in the estate gift ledger the bequest of one garnet ring in a gilt setting, purchased in Florence in the year of our Lord 1787, to be given upon her death to Mrs. Harriet Fielding, companion, in recognition of 11 years of faithful and devoted service. He read that this record bore the signature of the late Duke of Ashworth as witness. He read that the gift had been noted as delivered to Mrs. Harriet Fielding on the date of the late Duchess's passing, being the 14th day of March, 1806. He closed the ledger. The dowager had not sat back down. She stood with her hands at her sides, and her face had the quality Nora had once seen in a winter window the moment before the ice gives. Edmund looked at his mother. He looked at the ring on her smallest finger, and something passed across his face that was not condemnation, and was not pity, but was the particular clarity of a man who has looked at a thing directly for the first time, and can no longer pretend he has not seen it. He crossed the room to Nora. She held very still. She was aware of every person in the room the way one is aware of cold air, peripherally, all at once. He said, in the silence that Mr. Grenda. Draper's reading had made in front of the assembled company, and the dowager and Miss Crane in her ice-blue silk. Miss Fielding keeps the ring, and she stays in this house. Lady Crane said something. Not a sentence. A half-formed protest that never became a word. The Reverend Mallory cleared his throat. The Aston family, both of them, looked at the window, with the careful attention of people who have decided to be fascinated by the garden. The dowager looked at Edmund for a long moment. Then she looked at the ring on her own finger. Her hand moved, the smallest motion, a reaching that became a pause. She was a woman who had organized her world for 30 years, and she understood, in this room, in this silence, that one of her arrangements had been built on something she had not wished to name. She was not, Nora thought, a wicked woman. She was a woman whose categories had served her so long that she had stopped examining them. The dowager drew the ring from her finger and set it on the table beside her, the small sound of gold on wood carrying clearly in the quiet room. Edmund turned to Mr. Draper and thanked him for coming. Mr. Draper said it was entirely his pleasure and that he hoped the records had been of use. The Cranes gathered themselves for departure. There were brief, correct farewells. The drawing room emptied in the way of rooms after a verdict has been delivered, people moving toward doors with the particular purpose of those who have urgent business elsewhere. Nora did not touch the ring. Not yet. She stood where she was, her hands at her sides, until the room was still. Edmund came back. He stood at the distance propriety required, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that had been watching her since the kitchen passage, and the linen corridor and the library, the accumulation of that watching now unconcealed. "You have been in this house a long time," he said. 3 years, she said. "My mother was here before me, I know." He looked at the ring on the table. He picked it up and held it out to her. On his open palm, the way one offers something that was never one's to keep. She took it. The gilt was warm from the dowager's hand, but the garnet was cool. The slight asymmetry of the setting immediately familiar under her thumb. She had not held it in 5 years. She had not been certain she would ever hold it again. The cord at her throat held the amber bead her mother had worn for 20 years. The ring had been on her mother's hand for 11. Together, they were the whole of a life she had not been allowed to mourn cleanly. and standing there in the December drawing room with both of them in her possession, she felt the particular quality of grief that has been waiting a long time to be legitimate. She did not weep. She pressed the ring into her palm and kept her face still, and thought of Harriet at the window with the charcoal, and the patience and the careful voice. "She was a good woman," Nora said. "My mother. She was educated and kind, and she served faithfully for 11 years, and she was not thanked for it except by a woman who is now dead." "I know," Edmund said again quietly. "I am sorry for it." It was not enough. It was also more than she had ever received, and she recognized the difference between what was owed and what was possible, and she had learned long enough ago that demanding the impossible was the quickest way to lose the possible. "Will you stay?" he said. She looked at him. She thought about the library, and the portrait, and the way he had steadied the kindling without ceremony, and stood aside to let her pass, and looked at her across the housekeeper's room with the expression she had refused to name. She thought about Matthew dead at Salamanca, and the wrong man survived, and the house that felt like the wrong answer to a question. She thought about her mother at the window, teaching her the letters and the amber bead, and the ring in her hand. "Yes," she said. The word was plain, and it was not a small thing. He nodded once, and she saw in the small motion something that she had watched accumulate across 6 weeks in kitchens and passages and libraries and now resolved into the simplest of postures, a man who has found the correct answer to a question he had been afraid to ask. He did not say anything more. He did not need to. The December light was coming through the drawing-room windows, thin and clean, and the house around them had gone quiet in the way of rooms after something irrevocable has happened. She put the ring in her pocket, next to her skin for safekeeping. In the weeks that followed, the dowager did not leave the house, because it was winter, and the roads were poor, and she was, when all was said and done, a woman of 61, with nowhere particular to go. She and Nora arrived at a kind of careful civility that was not warmth and was not hostility, and was perhaps the only thing available to two women who held the same man's regard at different distances. The dowager did not speak of the ring. She did not need to. The ledger had spoken. Mr. Draper returned in January on estate business and stayed for dinner. And at dinner he told the table that the old Duke's gift ledger was a remarkably thorough document, meticulously kept, and that it was his professional opinion that the late Duke had been a man of genuine precision in all matters of record. He said this in the direction of Edmund, and did not look at the dowager. And Edmund said that he had always believed his father to be so, and the topic was closed. Edmund found occasions to be in rooms where Nora was working, which was not precisely proper, and which Mrs. Hatch observed with the particular blindness of a woman who has been in service long enough to know which walls to look at. He did not say a great deal in these occasions, which suited Nora, who had learned to be suspicious of men who talked too much. He brought her a book from the library once, a volume of music theory her mother had apparently used during her years in the house, found in a box in the estate room that had not been opened in a decade. He set it on the table beside her without ceremony, and went out. She opened it and found her mother's handwriting in the margins, small and neat, annotations in the voice of a woman working through a thing she loved carefully. She closed it. She held it for a moment. Then she set it on the shelf above her bed where she could see it. In February, he asked her to walk with him in the park, in the correct manner, with Mrs. Kai, Hatch's niece, as chaperone, 20 paces behind, and fiercely attentive. They walked the full length of the frost-stiffened path, and spoke about the estate and a spring planting in the roof that wanted mending above the east wing, and none of this was what they were talking about, and both of them knew it. At the far end of the path where the stone wall met the iron gate, and the fields opened beyond it, he stopped. "I should have come home sooner," he said. "Matthew has been dead 2 years, and I spent them on the continent, telling myself I was settling his affairs." He looked at the fields. "I was avoiding the house. You came home," she said. "The wrong man did." She thought about this for a moment. The February air was cold and clear, and she could see her breath. "You are the man who came back," she said finally. "I cannot speak to the other question. I don't believe anyone. Can I?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he turned to look at her, and she felt the looking as a physical thing, the full weight of gray eyes that had been watching her and withholding their conclusions for 6 weeks. "Nora," he said. Her given name. For the first time in his voice, plainly, she held very still. "I find that I would very much like to know what you think," he said. "About most things for a considerable time." It was not a declaration of a conventional kind. It was something more specific than that, and she had spent long enough in his company by now to know that specific was what he was. "I think," she said, "that I would find that acceptable." He held out his hand. She looked at it, and then at his face, and she put her own hand in his, and they stood at the iron gate in the February cold with Mrs. Planctus, Hatch's niece, pretending to examine a frost-covered rose cane 20 paces back, and the pale winter light was on both their faces. By the time the spring arrived, the matter had been settled in the manner available to them, with Mr. Remete, Draper again in attendance and the Reverend Mallory presiding, and a small gathering in the drawing-room where once a different arrangement had been announced and then quietly set aside. The dowager attended in her best black silk and sat at the edge of the assembled company with the posture of a woman learning to occupy a world that has not arranged itself to her specifications, which is to say she sat as she always sat, upright and composed, because she was a woman who did not bend in public regardless of what the public had witnessed. Miss Crane sent a brief, polite note of congratulation that said nothing and meant less, and was perfectly correct. That evening, when the house had quieted and the guests had gone, and the candles were burning low in their brackets, Nora sat by the fire in the small sitting room that was now hers, and she put the ring on her own finger. The garnet caught the firelight. The gilt setting held its slight asymmetry, the stone left of center, the memory of a door handle and a repair, and a life that had been lived with more dignity than the world had bothered to see. She touched the amber bead at her throat with her other hand. Outside the window, the first light snow of the season was falling on the park, soft and unhurried. Edmund came in from the passage, having spoken to the steward about the morning's arrangements, and he stopped in the doorway when he saw her by the fire, and the expression on his face was the one she had watched accumulate across every passage and library and winter afternoon, no longer deniable, no longer withheld. "She would have been glad," Nora said, meaning her mother, meaning the ring, meaning the fire and the snow and the house that had once held everything Harriet Fielding cared for and then taken it back so quietly. Edmund came and sat beside her, at the correct distance, and then at a shorter distance, and said, "Yes," in the simple way of a man who means it. The fire burned steadily. The snow fell past the window. The ring on her finger carried its garnet steady, and read as a held breath at the center of a quiet room. She had her mother's words in the margins of the music book upstairs. She had the bead at her throat. She had the ring that had been taken and then returned, and was now at last exactly where it had always been meant to sit. This is where the story rests. If Harriet Fielding's daughter moved you tonight, stay a moment and tell us so. We will be here when you need another. The snow went on falling, and the house held its warmth, and the fire said nothing further, which was enough.